Good evening, and welcome to St. Ignatius Parish's Adult Faith Formation Fall Speaker Series, Encountering Vatican II, Living into the Council with Francis. We especially welcome all of those joining us online and the generous donors whose support has made this series possible. My name is Lisa Fries, and I am the Director of Faith Formation here at St. Ignatius. Tonight, we welcome our sixth and final speaker, Dr. Massimo Faggioli, to speak with us about the effects of the Second Vatican Council on the Church and probably the world. Dr. Faggioli is a professor of historical theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. His areas of expertise include the papacy, Vatican II, the Roman Curia, liturgical reform, new Catholic movements, and Catholicism and global politics. He is a contributing writer for Commonweal and a columnist for LaCroix International. At Villanova, Dr. Faggioli teaches courses on modern church history, Catholicism and world politics, and ecclesiology, both at the undergrad and graduate level. Dr. Faggioli's books and essays have been published in more than 10 languages. In 2018, he received the Catholic Press Association Award for his book Catholicism and Citizenship, Political Cultures of the Church in the 21st Century. His recent book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, offers the first in-depth exploration of now President Biden's Catholicism in the context of American politics. NCR columnist and former speaker in this series, Michael Sean Winters has described Massimo as the outstanding U.S. ecclesiologist of our time. Tonight, we are thrilled to have him here with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Massimo Faggioli.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction and for the invitation to speak here. My first time in San Francisco. I enjoyed my time immensely here at the Jesuit community and in this parish. My job tonight is to talk about the effects of the Second Vatican Council in the Church. And the first thing I want to try and say is that when we talk about the effects of the Second Vatican Council, we should try and distinguish different kinds of effects, because one of the problems that I think is typical of our ecclesial debate, especially in this country, about the Second Vatican Council, is that the entire spectrum of positions seems to be focused on the social, political effects of a church event in the contemporary world. And these effects are very important, but these effects are not the only ones that we should consider when we want to think about Vatican II, when we want to know Vatican II, what it was, and what still is in our church and in our world. So this is a particular time and a critical time to talk about Vatican II, because we live in a time of crisis, which is not just at the political level or at the social level, but, for example, the environmental crisis. So Vatican II is seen in light of a certain ecclesial crisis, where Vatican II is clearly challenged by intra-Catholic forces, intra-Catholic movements that have an anti-Vatican II agenda, a narrative, and program. Vatican II is at the center of a national conversation which goes beyond the boundaries of the Catholic Church, because we know the kind of role certain Catholic voices or Catholic movements, Catholic news agencies have had in these last few years in our national conversation, in our politics, and not just in the United States, but also other countries like Italy, Hungary, Poland, France, and other countries. And thirdly, Vatican II is challenged by a certain rupture in the international order. This is a world that looks a little different from how the fathers and the theologians of the Second Vatican Council imagined it, which was in the 60s, was a future where democracies were going to be accepted and celebrated in all parts of the world, especially in Catholic countries. We know that it has not been like that, and it is not like that these days. So what does this say on the Second Vatican Council, on that proposal, on that theology, on that message? Is this the end of the era of the Second Vatican Council? Certainly some would like to think that. It's their hope. I think it's certain that this is the end of a certain Catholic world, or of a certain way of understanding how to be a Christian and member of the Catholic Church in this world. Since Vatican II, especially in these last 60 years, there have been monumental changes in the way we live, and especially in 4 areas, our ways of living and of understanding ourselves, our individualities, our communities, our faith experience has been changed enormously. These 4 areas have been identified recently by one of the most important scholars of Catholicism in the contemporary world, the French sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger, who wrote an important book that was published at the beginning of this year. And so the first huge transformation is the end of the Catholic ghetto, so-called Catholic ghetto, which was a kind of a bubble in which many Catholics lived in many important countries for Catholicism. Second, the enormous changes in the idea and the experience of the family. Third, a disruption in a positive way of the old established relations between the church and the political order in a more pluralist way, more respectful of the secular dimension of our societies, but clearly disruptive of a very long tradition within Catholic thinking. And fourth, what the impact of science and technology have on our understanding of the faith. Clearly, we live in a time where all these changes have been compounded and made into a dramatic, explosive situation that we usually call the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, but it's much more than a criminal crisis. It's a theological crisis that has to do with the old perfect coexistence between a clerical system and a patriarchal logic. It's very clear that the future of the church is about the role of women in the church. And keep in mind that all these last few, emergencies were barely addressed by the Second Vatican Council in a direct way, in an explicit way. So we might think that Vatican II has nothing to say about those things, that it is exhausted, is an exhausted project. I think, again, that this is one of the wishes that is being broadcast often, also by very prominent national commentators in our media. I think this is a very false narrative, because I believe that the very fact that Catholicism is at the center of our civilizational conversations, what's going to happen to our societies, to our human dimension, to our families, to our bodies, to our way we live, to the way we live, I believe it confirms paradoxically the success of the Second Vatican Council. Because one of the things that is barely and rarely mentioned is that it is true that Catholicism has become sociologically weaker, thinner, or less visible than it was in the first half of the 20th century. At the same time, and again, if we think about the central role that Catholicism, Catholics' political culture has in this country, it has had in these last few years, it is hard to deny, I think, that Catholicism emerged as an incredibly important reservoir of memoirs, but also of expectations, of values in our society that is in search for certainty and for new identities. So the social, cultural crisis that Catholicism is living these days, I believe it is one of those signs that Vatican II has updated and renewed Catholicism in a way that has not made it something that has a place only in a museum, but that is at the center of our national conversations, our international conversations. Just think about the kind of visibility that Pope Francis has, not his persona, but what he has said on migration, on the environment, on citizenship, on minorities, on acceptance in our church. So here, 60 years after the Second Vatican Council, we see a paradoxical or contradictory image. On the one hand, we see a sociologically weakened church, but on the other hand, I think we see a church that has captured, back in the 60s, much more at the level of intuition, of mysterious insight, much more at that level than at an intellectually articulated way, some of the issues that have become so prominent in the 21st century. So what should we think about Vatican II today when we try to understand the effects of this council? So here, I believe that the pontificate of Pope Francis has been a blessing because it has given us back Vatican II in its entirety. Not Vatican II just as a collection of documents, of those 16 documents, and actually the Vatican II doesn't only have 16 documents, there are other documents that are usually forgotten, like the opening speech of Pope John the 23rd on the 11th of October 1962, Gaudium et Mater Ecclesiae. It doesn't belong to the official list of the 16 documents, but this is the key of everything in some sense. The October 20th, 1962 message to humanity, which is the first document that was approved by the bishops in St. Peter, and it contains in just a couple of sentences everything that is important in Vatican II. It was 2 sentences. The Church wants to be like Jesus. It's not here to be served, but to serve. In those 2 sentences, which were approved before all other debates on the liturgical reform, on Gaudium et Spes, there's everything there. That document doesn't belong to the official list of the 16 documents, 4 constitutions, 9 decrees, and 3 declarations. Pope Francis has given back to us all of it in open, visible ways and in invisible ways, more mysterious ways. That is very important because what has happened to this very narrow analysis of the effects of the Second Vatican Council in terms of the social political effects is a product of a very idiosyncratic and often ideological selection of what Vatican II is. Vatican II is not a series of documents. It's an act. It's an event. It's a moment where the Church spoke after listening to God and to the Holy Spirit. A certain Vatican II literalism. What does this document say on this issue? On marriage and family, or on the economy, or on Scripture? How does that translate in the world 50 years later, 60 years later? That's something that must be done, but that is just one way of looking at the Second Vatican Council and understanding what Vatican II is. This is important because, so this comeback of the Second Vatican Council and this effort of Francis and of many others that have made this pontificate an ecclesial event, not just a personality issue, is that we understand now that there is a new kind of battle for the Second Vatican Council. And this is why it's very important, this series of events, like the one that has been organized here, but also in the context of the synodal process. Why? Because for a long time, the usual way to talk about the Vatican II was to say, even among those who were not really convinced by Vatican II, by that theology, that event, and its effects, it has been for a long time, Vatican II was good, it's part of the tradition, the problem was only in the way it has been implemented. That has been the narrative of a certain conciliar skepticism for a long time. The situation has changed in these last 10 or 15 years. I believe that we have moved towards a different kind of battle for the legacy of the Second Vatican Council, which is more radical. We are no longer, and I say here, I mean myself, as a Vatican II Catholic theologian, we are not just facing a mild skepticism about Vatican II. We are facing now in the Church an active narrative that says Vatican II was not just wrong in the way it was interpreted and applied, it was a mistake itself. Those documents were a mistake. We have seen this. And one of the phenomena that has been typical of these last few years is one of the most worrying and one of the most unimaginable in my mind, which was the mainstreaming of a certain anti-Vatican II extremism. What used to be in the 1970s, 80s, at the fringes of our ecclesial conversation, of our information system in the Catholic Church, it has become mainstream. It has become accepted. It has become also published in national newspapers, like, for example, the New York Times, in the name of a mistaken idea of diversity. It has been accepted by some of our bishops in this country, but in other countries. So there is at work an agenda within the Church that is clearly interested in labeling Vatican II as something that happened for mysterious ways that we cannot really understand, and it must be labeled as a naive mistake that was made collectively by the Church. This is very serious, this is very important, because this has enormous consequences that are not just at the level of what we do, at the social level, at the political level, what we can think we can argue for in the public square, our freedom of voting in the elections, our freedom of expressing our opinions in the Church. It goes much deeper. It's much more insidious. Why? Because Vatican II was not just a set of directives for Catholics to behave in a certain way. It contains a series of very deep theological, spiritual insights that we have, unfortunately, all of us, we have taken for granted for too long. There has been a certain Catholic narrative on the Vatican II side that basically said, Vatican II happened, we did it, we won, it's done. Now it's time to look forward to Vatican III or to the next millennium. But that fight was won, and those battles have been won once and for all. This is a very serious mistake for what happens in the Church, but also in our countries, our constitutions, our fundamental values. It's a daily commitment. Saying Vatican II was a mistake or was a naive mistake means diminishing, belittling the huge theological advancement that were made possible by Dei Verbum, Scripture and the tradition. This is something that is never mentioned by these intellectuals whose focus is exclusively on the social political situation that make a certain argument against Vatican II. So the theological aspects of the Second Vatican Council are rarely mentioned because they cannot be reduced to a political narrative. That is a big problem. Dei Verbum. What would this church be if we would go back to the idea that lay Catholics should not read Scripture? I cannot imagine the church being able to go back. The liturgical reform, which is in many of our local churches, it has escalated to very dangerous levels of what is more Catholic. Is Latin more Catholic, or English more Catholic, or vernacular languages more Catholic. That misses the whole point, which is that in the way we celebrate, there is an idea of the church, liturgy and ecclesiology. Lumen Gentium, the idea of the church as a communion. How much is left to do to implement Lumen Gentium? Much, for sure, but surely Lumen Gentium has liberated us from the idea that the church is a perfect society that doesn't need anything to become holy or a better church. Gaudium et Spes, a church that lives in history, is not of this world, but lives in this world. Lives in this world, in a deep solidarity, active with the one human family. How prophetic is this message in a world where many more walls and borders of separation have been built in these last few years? Unitatis Redintegratio on ecumenism. Ecumenical dialogue is something that is not just important to understand the others, the non-Catholics, but to understand ourselves. How much we have understood about ourselves in dialogue with non-Catholics. Dignitatis Humanae, in some sense the most American of all documents of the Second Vatican Council, because the most important theologian working at that document was an American Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, who paid dearly in the decade before Vatican II for what he had written, said, and taught about religious liberty. It's not being a member of the right church that gives you the freedom of religion. It's your being a human person. It's at the very basis of everything Francis has said in his trips in the Middle East, for example. This idea of citizenship, there are values that belong to the human person as a human person, not as a member of that group or that church or the community. The forgetting in the United States by many US bishops of the most American of all documents of the Second Vatican Council is one of the most shocking things, in my opinion. I would have never imagined that. Finally, Nostra Aetate. It's a conveniently forgotten document because it's the foundation of the rejection of anti-Semitism. It's true, it doesn't talk about a more sensitive theological question for Catholics, which was anti-Judaism. There are shortcomings in all documents of the Second Vatican Council, but that Nostra Aetate is really our firewall against the return of anti-Semitism. And I could go on and on. All these documents really are the DNA of what Catholicism is today. Even unconsciously, because I'm sure that also those who say they don't like Vatican II, they would not like to live in a church that denies them the rights that Vatican II gave them. It's one of the most ironic things that those who have most enjoyed of the renewal of Catholic theology, of Catholic ecclesiology, and they have enjoyed that, and they have decided that they feel part of the Catholic Church because of those changes that happened at the Second Vatican Council. Now apparently they have decided that that offering was too generous for all the others. This is a very dangerous view of the effects of the Second Vatican. It is very idiosyncratic it is very privatized. That is an understanding of the effects of the Second Vatican Council, which is exactly contrary to the Catholic spirit of the Second Vatican Council. So here, I believe that when we talk about the effects of the Second Vatican Council, we should try and distinguish what has to be part of our view and attention, which is on what happens in society, in our politics, in our economy. But we must also look at another part of the effects of the Second Vatican Council that is often forgotten or, again, taken for granted, especially in three areas. One, Vatican II had effects of a profound theological renewal. In this sense, especially, it's a church that values the tradition, but is not enslaved to the tradition. It's a living understanding of the tradition. I just discovered a few weeks ago, to my amazement, that one of the most used translations of the documents of the Second Vatican Council into English, the translation of a key paragraph of De Verbum 12, the Latin says, Vivae Traditionis, of the living tradition, and that English translation, which is the most used, says only tradition, without living. It's a very different idea. So it's an idea of a theology that is based in the tradition, but in a living way. That is not wedded once and for all to European culture, to one cultural matrix, but it is really Catholic, it is really universal. That is at the basis of the Second Vatican Council. Second, Vatican II is a spiritual event also, as a spiritual message with a very demanding task. It's a church that accepted, again, in ways that were more at the level of insight and of intuition more than at an explanatory way. It's a church that understands that cannot live its mission only thanks to the political support of a particular kind of regime or order, social status, ethnicity, race, system of relations between genders. This is one of the most incredibly revolutionary ways in which Vatican II has become really a prophetic message. That's why a certain kind of commentariat against Vatican II has decided to make of Vatican II the target, because Vatican II has this message that the gospel cannot become an instrument of a political narrative, of a nationalist narrative, of a class narrative. Finally, third, Vatican II has changed the church institutionally. We are used to talk about the church as a communion, synodality, and again, it's something we take for granted, that the church is us, that we are the church. One of the things that is typical of a certain impoverished application of the Second Vatican Council in the post-Vatican II period is in the Code of Canon Law. And I believe the church needs a code of canon law, but one of the things that is still evident there is that while the Second Vatican Council talks about the members of the church as living parts of this church, in a canonical understanding of the church, we, especially we lay people, we still are like foreign aliens without rights. I'm quoting a very famous canon lawyer, a German scholar. This has changed really how we look at the Second Vatican Council and how we look at the church. So here Vatican II had enormously important effects on the very internal ways of the church, of understanding itself, of functioning, of approaching God's revelation, of transmitting God's revelation, of celebrating, of understanding the world outside. So, where are we now with all of that? So, first, I believe that what is underway, and this is really one of the things that makes me optimistic, is that what we have seen in these last few years, especially in the English-speaking world, is a revival of studies on the Second Vatican Council. I am one of the many who are doing this. I see many young scholars, much younger than I am, who really are a product of a certain revival of studies on the Second Vatican. This is a great sign of hope. And unfortunately, we live in a church that is very keen on keeping theologians hidden or at the margins. And conversely, there are some theologians who take sometimes pride in staying far from ecclesial conversations. That needs to change. But the first thing that I think needs to change for a recovery of the Second Vatican Council is to extract, exfiltrate, liberate our theological, ecclesial conversations from what we usually call the culture wars. And this is not just because it is uncomfortable, it is annoying, it is noisy, it is distracting, but because it contradicts one of the intuitions of the Second Vatican Council, which was articulated in a famous essay that was written by one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, a German Jesuit, Karl Rahner, in 1954, when no one was imagining anything like Vatican II, in 1954, he said, this church needs to overcome an imperial, territorial understanding of itself, and it must accept the idea that in the contemporary world, Christianity will take the shape more of a diaspora than of an empire. This is an extremely challenging message, extremely challenging. In some sense, Vatican II fell short in that task that Rahner gave to us almost a decade before Vatican II. But in some sense, Vatican II saw that on the horizon. Again, Vatican II is not just an intellectual exercise. This is one of the big mistakes. Even less, it was not a legal seminar, how to rearrange the church with legal texts. It was a spiritual event, a cultural event, that works also at looking far at the horizon, what's coming, and not always being able to phrase what's happening and how we should respond. But Vatican II saw something like that. So, for example, Vatican II is very clear on the need to rebalance the papalist extremism of Vatican I with more power for the bishops. That hasn't worked always in the way Vatican II imagined. But at the same time, Vatican II is not giving a blank check to our bishops. It never did that. We should recover a certain element of ecclesial system of checks and balances, which is exactly what's happening with the synodal process, synodality, which is, again, it's one word that does not exist in the corpus of the Second Vatican Council. It's never mentioned, but it's on the horizon. They can see that. It's in the way they imagine the church. It's a church that is ministerial. It's all ministerial. Ministry is not just the priestly ministry. It's not just the bishop ministry. This is something that in Lumen Gentium is already there in liminal ways, in ways that are not always explained in full. It's an event, Vatican II, that saw for the first time a substantial participation of women in the conversations before Vatican II, during, after. This is one of the recent scholarship on Vatican II has discovered. Because as long as our understanding of Vatican II is Pope and bishops, we will miss an entire part of that picture. So does Vatican II talk openly about the ministry of women in the church? No. Does Vatican II confirm the previous system as it was? No. So here there are elements that are now being rediscovered. So I want to conclude here by quoting one of the most interesting thinkers of the Catholic Church, a French Benedictine, Ghislain Lafont, who wrote a very little book a few years ago, and he said, Vatican II, we are just starting to understand Vatican II because Vatican II has told us about a church that was no longer identified with a certain system of power and of authority and of hierarchy. And Lafont called the age opened by Vatican II as a kind of a third age with a Joachimite echo, but he said Vatican II has made Catholicism Christian in a new way because it has inaugurated what Lafont called the era of the wounded love. You can connect that idea of wounded love to so many of our conversations in the church, in our society, on same-sex marriage, the abuse crisis, having a pope who's a wounded pastor, not just because of his physical ailments, but because he comes from an experience of having been wounded in his vocation, in his life. So this is something that I believe gives back to the Second Vatican Council something that belongs to that. Here it is essential, I believe, to rediscover Vatican II and to make it really not an exercise in nostalgia of two different kinds, because there's the nostalgia of those who would like to go to the pre-Vatican II era, but there's also the nostalgia of those who would like to go back to the times of Vatican II, the 1960s. Both nostalgias are not useful, I think. So there has to be a moment, and I think that the synodal process between now and the end of 2024, at least, is Pope Francis' way to invite the whole Church to rediscover that message of the Second Vatican Council that, for some, on the one side of the spectrum, was too modern to be Catholic. And for others, on the other side, was too Catholic to be modern. I believe Vatican II was really a synthesis of the Catholic modern. I believe it is necessary to reinvent and reimagine how we talk about Vatican II outside, without political narratives that are often just a veil for a profound ignorance of what Vatican II was. And so, in all humility, what I tried to do tonight, and in these previous 25 years when I studied Vatican II, is to be a servant of that event, of that teaching, and of the Church that is a fruit of the Second Vatican Council in ways that we are sometimes too naive or too disingenuous to see as the fruit of the Second Vatican Council. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're back now. Dr. Faggioli, just such great appreciation for all you've shared, and it feels like we've been drinking from a fire hose a little bit. I have so many pages of notes in just a few moments, but really just some wonderful ideas that I'm going to walk away with today. And I think I want to thank you, especially because I cannot think of a better completion of our series, because you've left it very open-ended. It seems to me that you've left us with an enterprise to go on to, and that I'm intrigued. I'm going to go through a few of these things, hopefully in something of an orderly fashion, and then we'll take questions from the community here and online. You said early on that you think that the very controversy around, if I understood you correctly, the very controversy around the Second Vatican Council is itself a sign of its importance and life. And I'd love you to flesh that out, about that the church is sociologically weaker, but has an insight that is vital and seems more vital in the society today. Could you flesh that out a bit, if I'm catching it correctly? Right.
So what I meant is this, is that a certain anger against Vatican II comes from the fact that a few groups of Catholic intellectuals, especially in the English-speaking world, especially in the United States, they have discovered that a certain project of making Catholicism conservative again, and politically conservative, okay, not traditional, but politically conservative, has failed. That it is impossible because Vatican II has made Catholicism not subject to these narratives that can be implemented more easily in some local situations, but at the global level. That's why the furious reactions against Pope Francis from the very beginning of his pontificate, the spring and the summer of 2013, before the synod, before everything else. So they understand, these anti-Vatican II intellectuals, or those who say Vatican II should be interpreted in a certain way which is not Francis, they understand deep in their heart, I think, that Vatican II is fundamentally an obstacle against bending the Catholic Church to an ideological, partisan, political national narrative. And this has been so evident in this country because we have seen that there has been a manipulation of Catholic teaching, of Catholic personalities, documents, at a very high level politically. The Supreme Court, we all know all of that. So this has been the story of these last 10, 15 years, I think.
Just to follow up on that, and I was going to say, it seems there's also been a great pronouncement of the centrality of Catholicism to a number of very high-placed, very conservative members of recent governments in the United States especially, but I think around the world. And it seems to me that it's something of a chicken and egg kind of question. It seems did the anti-Vatican II draw in these people, or are these people finding the need to somehow oppose and undo Vatican II, or try to undo Vatican II?
So the undoing of Vatican II is something that has been attempted and is being attempted. The attempts to undo the liturgical reform is number one, because Vatican II started with the liturgical reform, and everything started with that debate and that constitution, and they know that the best way to undo Vatican II is to undo the liturgical reform. So, but what I think is important to understand the place of the Second Vatican Council and Catholicism in the United States is this, is that we have in the late 80s, 1990s, the so-called neoconservative movement, which said basically, well, Vatican II was good, but it was implemented in ways that were unfaithful, and so on. So that same movement, those same circles, in 20 years, they have abandoned a certain respectable conservative Catholic view of things to jump over to an extremist understanding of what Catholicism should be, which has gone even beyond what I imagined, because there have been open attacks against the very legitimacy of Pope Francis, which is something that I would have never imagined in my life. So you see that here Vatican II has changed position in their ideological view, because once they understood that the hermeneutics was not enough, they have resorted to a rejection of the whole thing as such. Right. That is something that I believe must be addressed, not just by theologians, but also by bishops, I think. And there have been some who have done that, but many others have chosen not to become involved in that. I believe that it should be their duty to defend Vatican II and to defend Pope Francis.
This wasn't in your talk, but do you think the crisis, you mentioned it just in passing, that the sexual abuse and response to sexual abuse in the church has empowered that movement as well? Because it seems there's a lot of blaming the reforms of Vatican II for the sexual abuse crisis, even though most of the people were not trained under that.
Sure, we have seen certainly the attempt to weaponize the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, even if we know that it is something that starts well before. It has been, in my opinion, one of the most, I just want to say, despicable way of using that scandal in ways that don't serve the church. I believe that the abuse crisis is a massive moment of awakening for all of us to what has shocked us in different ways, but the abuse crisis, so there is a topicality of the debate of Vatican II in this country and the role that this country has played in the global narrative on the abuse crisis. It's not a coincidence. I think there is more than a coincidence.
Yeah. I'm going to only ask one more thing because I think we have a lot of questions from the community. But I do want to ask you to go a little deeper into that notion of the church as the era of wounded love. And I think this ties back to the abuse crisis, but to the issues of LGBTQ people, and you mentioned a few of these. This notion that the church, I think this is tied to your idea that Vatican II was not just a series of documents, but was an event that changed us in a more fundamental way. The notion of wounded love, do you see this as something that the church is part of the resistance to Vatican II, the part of the resistance to experiencing ourselves as wounded, or is it the way in which maybe Vatican II can take a deeper root within us? I'd love you to explore that more.
So I think that in indirect ways, the idea of the era of the wounded love has become part of our theological conversations. Just think about vulnerability, which is a very important word. But what I think Lafont meant, and this touches me deeply, is that Vatican II was a religious event and a spiritual event in the sense that, from the very first few days, there was this idea that at the center there is the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a story of wounded love that ends on a cross. It's not a story of success. It's not a story of domination, of asserting a system of power. Vatican II was a deeply kenotic event of leaving what is non-essential, what is an obstacle to the gospel aside, in ways that are, in some cases, more radical. So that's, I believe, it's a deep insight that is much deeper than the narrative on the modernization. And it's all true. If one looks at how the bishop's ministry was conceived, for example, funny story. When they think how to push this idea of the retirement of bishops, what's the model they use? It's the model of the retirement of university professors in Europe, which is not exactly what one would think about bishops. So there is a modernizing aspect. Okay? But what is fundamental is the Christological assumption of something that should reshape the church. Because the idea is that the church cannot be self-sufficient without the paschal mystery. This has consequences that if you look at the church exclusively from what happened in the United States since the late 60s to Catholics in politics, in the courts and so on, you don't see that. And so that's why we need to rediscover the theological and the spiritual dimension of the Second Vatican Council to make sense of what has happened outside, I think.
I did say that would be my last question. I'm going to lie, just because what you said just now, it seems this ties back to your quote from Ronner about the church marked more as a diaspora than as an empire. And it sounds to me as that what you're saying about the Second Vatican Council, the event of the Second Vatican Council, in some ways, it's an undoing of the official recognition of Constantine. And it's so difficult because it's so deep that it goes back all the way to the Constantinian idea of making the church an official body, which means that we're going to be split from the state not in a way that individuals won't belong to states or whatever, but that the idea of the church has to be freer than that. Is that?
Absolutely. So it's in Latin, the term protection that the state gives you contains that word, also the concept of becoming a subject, of becoming dependent of the political power. So there has to be a collaboration, there has to be a coexistence, a common effort for the common good, church and state and so on. But clearly Vatican II, I believe, is prophetic in the sense of saying what has been the master experience of European Christendom is no longer what can be imagined for the global Catholic Church. And so you can imagine how important this is now for Catholics who live in states where they are persecuted, because this is something that is happening again. So that it has liberated the voice of the church not to be an agent of a foreign culture, as it was perceived by many until Vatican II, but it is a different kind of presence that is not working on behalf of a political alliance or a geopolitical scheme. That is one of the things that it is hard to see again from an exclusively political perspective and domestic political perspective. My party or your party. It's a much bigger picture, I think.
Well, thank you. I want to invite questions from the floor. Thank you for that.
Can you see? Am I blocking you? Okay. Thank you. Wait. Sorry. We're going to go over here because of the speaker. Okay. We have a few questions from the online audience and also from our audience here. I think I'll start. You were referencing at the end, moving away from sort of the way Europe did Catholicism, so to speak. And one of the questions we have is, and this could be an entire different talk, so keep that in mind. From your own experience, can you discuss the relation of the church and the state, and contrasting kind of in the U.S. and Europe? Very.
Yeah. So yeah. Yes, not just one talk, but one entire course or semester.
Yes, exactly.
Sure. So here there is a fundamental difference in the way Europeans and Americans look at the relations church and state. In European history, and especially in Italian history, the state was built at the expense of the church. And so there is a different balance of power and of authorities constitutionally in different countries and so on. But there is this idea that the state is a recent construction that must be protected from religion. In America, there is, in some sense, the opposite view. So here, the separation of church and state has been interpreted lately, especially, as something that can protect religion from secularity, from the church. Okay. So this is something that is a transatlantic gap that influences much of the thinking of bishops and the intellectuals and so on. So here, Vatican II has a general view of the freedom of the church, but it doesn't mandate one particular pattern or system of relations. That is also because now we live in an even more complicated world. It is much more global Catholicism today than it was 60 years ago. And so here Gaudium et Spes has to be read as a statement of principles more than a list of the available options in the church-state relations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think this next question plays into that a little bit. I always understood that American bishops played a great part in shaping Vatican II. Today I see the Bishops' Conference moving away from Vatican II. Was the original role of U.S. bishops at the Second Vatican Council overestimated?
It was very important on a few issues, especially on religious liberty, on ecumenism. On other issues were controversial. Their voice, for example, these bishops were the one national bloc of bishops who voted against the condemnation in Gaudium et Spes of nuclear weapons because of the Cold War, because of that. So, in my opinion, the role of these bishops was much more important in the post-Vatican II period until the mid-80s, I would say, mid-late 80s. Okay, so because we have some fundamental, key documents that were approved by U.S. bishops that were really an application and a reception of the Second Vatican Council, the 1983 letter on social economic justice, of 86 on peace and war. And then I think that the rise of a certain neoconservative wave within this country and the sympathy for that wave that was back then in the Vatican has shaped the U.S. episcopate in a different way. And you're right, there has been, I believe, forgetting. If one looks, for example, at the key statements that were made by the U.S. bishops in this last decade to launch the campaign, the Fortnight for Freedom, it is really shocking to see how marginal is the role of the conciliar document on the freedom of religion. It is largely an American constitutional argument which is made that anyone could make, but not a Catholic argument for what kind of freedom of religion we have in mind, which is, according to Vatican II, a right of the human person, not a right of the church. Okay? So this has happened, I believe, and this is one of the causes of the tension between U.S. bishops and Pope Francis, because there is a difference of opinion on what role Vatican II should play.
Moving away from America slightly, another question that we had from the chat. I've struggled to understand the place in our church of lay movements such as Communion and Liberation, Catholics who are part of People of Praise, and other examples. How do they fit or embrace our church or not?
So, they have an important place. I think the future of the church is also in part in their hands. There is not one model of being Catholic lay movement in terms of of theological culture, political culture, social work, and so on. They are a Vatican II phenomenon in the sense that they took advantage in a good way of the freedom that was given to lay Catholics to do something new in terms of organization of their work and the relations with local bishops. So it is a complex history because there are movements that have shown a great deal of fidelity to the Second Vatican Council. Others have taken advantage of Vatican II, but at the same time they have presented themselves as the response to a pre-Vatican II kind of church. Okay, so I believe that what is happening with Pope Francis on that front now is very important because Pope Francis has introduced a more serious scrutiny of certain ways of being a movement that has been something that we haven't seen with John Paul II or Pope Benedict, that Francis, as a Jesuit, I think there's a wisdom in the discernment of spirits in these movements, and that has caused some frictions with them because they have understood that the times have changed for them a little. So it's a test. But I don't think this church in the future can be Catholic without these new movements. I don't believe. I think it's a sign of vitality overall.
Mm-hmm. And I think our last question is a good place to end. Does Vatican II have a message for non-practicing Catholics?
Absolutely, because they are the vast majority.
Yeah.
And no, I mean, it's very important because Vatican II, especially Lumen Gentium, but all documents, has an idea of what is the church, of what it's the meaning of being a member of the church, which is sacramental, it's not sociological, and even less political. So it says something in the sense that whether you are practicing or not, you are one of us. Mm-hmm. You are here with us, even when you're not here with us. It's very important because it redefines all those narratives that say Vatican II has destroyed a certain militant way of being Catholic. So here, I believe that there has to be a wise way of inviting them again back, because the sacramental life is not something that is concluded with your confirmation, but it's something that could be nourished, that must be nourished. Okay. So here, I believe that's why applying to Catholicism sociological methodologies that are applied to other kinds of churches don't work. I believe this is something that we have seen, that some scholars have drawn conclusions. Okay, this happened to the Catholic Church as it happened to other churches. Well, I believe Catholicism works in a different way, also because because what Vatican II says is not something completely new. It's more clear, it's more articulated, but it's essential not to make of this church, of the Catholic Church, a party or a club where if you don't pay your dues, you're out. This is a very dangerous way of understanding the church. And again, it's not an excuse for the status quo. But it also saves us from something that is extremely Catholic. This system of guilt, of you're not, I mean, it's theologically there is a much more inviting message there that it doesn't go across if you have in mind a powerful church as it was in the good old days, which were not so good maybe, right? So that's...
And how do we do that as lay people, right? How do we invite, and this was part of the question too, how do we reach out in this era of wounded love, kind of looking around and all these things that have happened? What would you say to us here?
So,
how do we do it?
So let me reply with what I see we should do in Catholic schools, universities, because this is where I live. I believe that there is the temptation sometimes to offer what is hot in the market of ideas and not what is really needed. So that's so I believe that there's there's a limit to the countercultural offer that you can make, okay? Because that could become comforting. Okay, I'm unpopular, that's why I'm right. It is a disaster usually. Okay, so I see that, for example, in academia, we tend sometimes to imagine that the students that come to us, they are the same students that I was. I mean, coming from a Catholic family, Catholic milieu, where the most important thing was to deconstruct and to disassemble Catholicism, okay, because what had been given to them was oppressive, was not liberating. Okay, what I see is that the students of today, they not always know what Catholicism is, even when they, I mean, to my amazement, some students told me that they didn't know what's the Catholic teaching on contraception, which usually it's not difficult to guess that, right? So, I mean, there has to be, I believe, a message of welcoming and an encounter which is unconditional, really unconditional. At the same time, there has to be, and I see that in academia, this idea that we want to help you build something in your life, in your community, in your family. It's trying not to replicate what was the emergency in previous decades, where the oppressive nature had been felt directly. I don't know if I'm clear here. So there is a certain loss of meaning out there. And I believe that there has to be a mix of unconditional welcoming, but at the same time, we have something that is special to offer, that you can find here, but you cannot find in your yoga club, or in your culture, in your book club, right? So it's a very fine line between being sensitive to what is out there and what is looked for without being told. It requires a lot of wisdom. I can say that now because I'm 51, almost 52 next week, and it took me time to understand that we live in times that are different from when I was a teenager, when I was a college student.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I don't know. Thank you.
I received a phone call shortly before we began tonight from Father Greg Bonfilio, who very much wanted to be here tonight. He was called away on an emergency to do his priestly ministry, which is always our first call, and he was unable to be here, much to his regret. And he wanted me to send his regards, his thoughts, his prayers, and how much he misses being with all of you, certainly with you, Massimo, particularly tonight. He also asked me to offer a few thank yous, because tonight is the last in our series of Encountering Vatican II. And I think it has been, I will speak personally here, it's been an amazing, amazing series. It really has been, and I was so moved by what was said tonight by Massimo, because of the whole notion of, we decided to call this Encountering Vatican II and not simply learning about Vatican II, because it is not, it was, as you said, it was an event. It wasn't simply a series of documents. And we hope that people will walk away from this series experiencing the encounter of that. And if you haven't watched the entire series, I would really encourage you to go back. I also want to say a few very important thank yous to so many people, and I'll try and keep these short. I got some notes from Greg, but I want to some of these I already know. I want to thank Joan and Bob McGrath, who were here at the very beginning and whose generosity has made this event possible. Have been a very big part of not just financially, but humanly. Were there at the first ask. They were ready to say, yes, this is a good idea. And occasionally I felt their spurs saying, why aren't you getting this going? Which was a good thing, And in that category, I'd also mention Annette Lamont, whose generosity, but also her goodness. Annette was one of the people who helped us to shape this and to move it forward, and encouraged us when there's 9 million things going across our desk to say, do this. This is important for the church. It's important for the parish. And so I'm grateful to the two of them. I want to thank Jay and Maddie Davies for their amazing support, who have just, when we asked, can you help us do this, they stepped forward. And Maureen Sullivan as well, for her generosity and encouragement to make a series that would be something that the St. Ignatius would profit from, but more importantly, could go out to others. And finally, among individual sponsors, I want to thank Rick Fain and Oscar Martinez Fain for their amazing generosity and their constant encouragement for this process and this encounter. I also want to thank our Jesuit companion ministries who joined in this with St. Ignatius, and it's sometimes more difficult to get Jesuits to collaborate with each other, but even their ministries. But we managed to do it, which is an act of amazing good and goodwill. And they really felt the need to bring alive Vatican II. So thanks to the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University and the Joan and Ralph Lane Center for Catholic Social Thought and Ignatian Tradition right here at the University of San Francisco. And also for the Office of Adult Spirituality at St. Ignatius College Preparatory. And beyond these great benefactors, I need to thank the people that we were, through these benefactors, we were able to attract people from around the the country who really spoke to the living importance of the Second Vatican Council, helped us to encounter it. From Michael Sean Winters, who really had the original idea of we should do something on Vatican. You should do something on Vatican II, I think he said to Greg. And Greg picked that ball up and passed it off to Lisa, and we ran with it. But Michael Sean Winters, who kicked off our series and launched it so well in his first talk. Rita Ferrone, who came to us by recommendation and opened our eyes to the whole experience of the liturgical renewal and the importance for the Constitution on the sacred liturgy, and how it was a key to understanding the whole of the Second Vatican Council. We were blessed by Jenna Hens-Piazza, who came just across the bay, but also opened our eyes to the whole world of Scripture, and her talk on Verbum Dei and on the importance of Scripture and how this was a new world that was created through that. Jeanette Rodriguez, who came and spoke to us of the church in the modern world, the Constitution on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, and how her vitality to bring to us not just the sense of the document, but the sense of how it has influenced in Latin America, in the developing world, in our own country, how it transforms the hope of peoples all around the world, and how it can continue to transform. And finally, just last week when Bradford Hinsey was here from Fordham University, who took on Lumen Gentium and showed us that the new thought of what the church is and what it might be, and how we organize the church as the people of God, and how that calls us to responsibility and also to opportunity. And finally, I don't know if I have words enough to thank Massimo Faggioli for being here. Your insight, your openness, your vitality, and your hope, above all of it, in the midst of so much pain in the church, to also offer us such incredible hope. I'm so grateful that you were here tonight. So thank you to Massimo. And finally, the staff at St. Ignatius is an amazing group of people who have given of themselves with tremendous generosity of this. And I want to particularly point out there are many people who did things. I'm just going to, because I know we want to get moving, I want to say Lisa Fries, who has done so much to spearhead. And I talked about spurs. There are very few people who wear spurs that land so effectively as does Lisa, and gets us moving so well, and does it all the time with a spirit of her own generosity. She never asks more of people than she gives double. She gives double of anything she asks of the rest of us, and is always doing it for the love of the people of God at this parish. And so I'm so grateful to be her colleague. So thank you. I'll give her one more round of applause. And finally, my last words are in thanks to all the people who have been here, both those who have been here in sometimes bracing themselves to bear up under the frigid conditions of the St. Ignatius Church without heat, but also all the people at home who are watching now and who have watched. I know there's a strong contingent from my former parish in Seattle that has watched this entire series. And I know there are people across the country who find hope here, who find perhaps sometime in their day-to-day parish, they may not find the life that they want, and yet they find that there is life in this church, that we are a wounded and a loving and a transforming people, and that Vatican II is possible, and that we can connect across this distance is a blessing to us. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here, for putting up with the cold, those of you who are here, for putting up with how to tune in, for those of you who are at home, for all those who will watch this when it's recorded or rewatch it over and over again. My great thanks to all of you. We are the church, and we are called to be something wonderful into the future. May God guide us. May God walk with us. May God be in our hearts and in our church. May God bless you all tonight. Thank you.